welcome to the Starting Admech series, the series where we go from your first purchase to your first 2000 point army list and everything in between for the Adeptus Mechanicus forces. In this video we'll continue where we left off by looking at the different Forge worlds. In the previous video we looked at Metallica and all it had to offer, which was quite a lot, thanks to all of the benefits that it received from the Warzone Caradon book. In this video we'll look at multiple Forge worlds, and we'll begin by looking at Lucius, which is currently in second place, but can very easily overtake Metallica for first place without much effort, thanks to the amount of raw power it has and options that it brings to the table as well. It is a very close competition between Metallica and Lucius for first place, and at the end of the day either one of these can end up being the best Forge world, with the other Forge world taking second or third place depending on where our third place pick will go. So what does Lucius have to offer for players willing to choose them as a Forge world? Well, to begin with, the Dogma offers two parts, both of which are rather good. The first part reads that when a unit with this Dogma is allocated damage from a source with a damage characteristic of 1, it gains +1 to its armor save. Considering there are quite a few weapons in the game that have a damage characteristic of 1, and many of them will be targeting your Vanguard or Rangers, this can get quite a lot of value by bumping up their save characteristic against weapons most likely to be allocated to them. Combine this with the Doctrina that gives them +1 to their save, and they quickly end up having a 2+ save that makes them surprisingly resilient to the firepower most effective against them. And remember, this also works with other units as well, meaning Sicarians can easily benefit from this, but it will generally be most effective on 1 wound models as they're most likely to be targeted with such weapons. However, in some cases like Electro Priest, they won't get much benefit due to their rather poor save to begin with, meaning that it is also somewhat dependent on the base save of the model that is being targeted as well. The second part of the Dogma adds 3 inches to the range of all range weapons equipped by models with this Dogma. This doesn't sound like much, but remember the first half of this Dogma is best with the Vanguard, and the second half is rather good with them as well, but also isn't bad with other short range units like Sicarians or Corpus Carry. As with Metallica, this means that the Vanguard or Sicarians can have their normal movement, gain 3 inches of range from this, and gain another 3 inches of range from the Doctrina that increases their movement by 3 inches, and then in the case of the Vanguard, advance and fire their assault weapons. However, unlike Metallica, this is on every unit with a range weapon, but the units do still suffer the penalties for advancing and shooting, as well as having a shorter overall range and no advancement stratagem to help them get across the board a little bit faster. In either case, it's similar but different and is still very strong when looked at from perspective of how many things can work in tandem with this ability, and as such you're going to get a lot more mileage out of it than you would expect. As for the unique Warlord trait that Lucius gets, it's rather powerful, being the Luminescent Blessing, which allows the Warlord to select a Lucius core unit within 9 inches and make it so that enemy attacks against it fail to wound on an unmodified roll of 1 through 3. This means your opponent will need a 4+ to wound the selected unit regardless of their abilities and strength profile, and this combined with the ability to go up to a 2+ normal save and other mitigation abilities, as well as the innate invulnerable save that Admech units have, it can really make your units feel invincible at times. Keep in mind as well, a lot of the Admech units have core, including Vanguard, Rangers, Sicarians, and Electro Priests, all of which have rather low toughness, making this have a lot more mileage. If you're playing the Lucius Forge world, you're probably going to be taking this trait in almost every case, as it is just that powerful and one that can carry games on its own in some situations. Moving on, the Lucius Stratagem isn't the strongest ability in the game, nor is it the strongest unique stratagem of any Forge world, but it does have its uses and can be rather good in the right situations. The stratagem is called Legio Teleportarium, and for 1 command point allows you to set up a chosen unit in reserves and then deep strike it into play as you wish. It has been a little nerfed in the 9th edition codex by getting a limitation in terms of how much you can use it, but that isn't the biggest deal, as you still have strategic reserves as an option, and normally didn't use the stratagem in the past more than once or twice prior to this change anyway. The best uses for this stratagem are rather straightforward, being that you either use it to gain more flexibility in terms of positioning when you wish to put a unit into strategic reserves, or you use it to get a discount for placing a unit into strategic reserves, as it always costs 1 command point regardless of the unit's power level, whereas the strategic reserve stratagem becomes more expensive the higher the power level of the units being placed within strategic reserves. Now, while the Lucius Stratagem received a minor nerf in the 9th edition codex, the Lucius Relic received a massive buff in comparison. In the prior codex, the Solar Flare allowed you to teleport the bearer once per game by removing them from the table and setting them up anywhere within 30 inches of their starting position on the battlefield that was more than 9 inches away from enemy units, and this alone was considered a rather strong ability to have. However, now you can teleport the bearer and 1 unit of Lucius core models within 3 inches of the bearer, and it doesn't even have that 30-inch range restriction anymore, but both units must end up wholly within 6 inches of one another. All of this makes the Solar Flare an absolute powerhouse of a relic that has a ton of different potential uses. uses. One major use would be to teleport a large unit of Vanguard or Rangers that become incredibly resilient thanks to Lucius Dogma and Warlord trait, while having very high output due to all of the different benefits that they gain within the new codex. And don't discount the Rangers, as you can easily teleport the Rangers into range of their rapid fire ability and double all of their shots by using a stratagem that makes their guns rapid fire instead of heavy fire. And just like the Vanguard, they benefit very heavily from the unique Warlord trait as well as the Dogma itself, so there's definitely a case to be made for Rangers or Vanguard in that situation. Another interesting use case is with Castellan robots, where you can use a data smith to make the Castellan robots a core unit and then place them into the Conqueror protocol using the binaric override stratagem that allows them to roll charges, while also having the Canticle active that allows them to roll 3 dice and discard the lowest when determining charge rolls. At this point, you teleport them 9 inches away from an enemy target, and you have a very good chance of making the charge roll with all of those buffs. This allows you to make great use of the new mixed weapon loadouts on the Castellan robots that you can get within the 9th edition codex, and is probably one of the main ways of making them worth their points. So if you like the Castellan robots, Lucius is definitely a Forge World you should be looking into. An important point to make about both the Solar Flare and the Legio Teleportarium stratagem is that you shouldn't just use it on the same exact units every game, but rather be flexible with how you use it, in that you consider which unit is best to teleport within each game depending on your opponent and the situation, as sometimes the offensive capabilities of the Castellan won't be as important as the defensive capabilities of a large Vanguard or Ranger block, and in other cases, simply the repositioning of a vital unit of Iron Striders may be important enough to consider using this relic on them, as the Iron Striders also happen to be a core unit. Overall, Lucius has gone from a rather strong Forge World in the previous codex to one that is a top contender for the best Forge World thanks in large part to its Relic and Warlord trait. The big thing about Lucius in comparison to Metallica is that Lucius still has a ton of versatility and options in terms of how you use it and the abilities that it provides, but instead of having an overabundance of situational abilities that can let you get the upper hand, it has a much more narrow scope of abilities that have a lot of raw power. It's still definitely a Forge World that requires a lot of thought when playing, but it's far less taxing than Metallica to play during long events, which can help it reach the status of the best Forge World as the meta changes, considering that you'll have a much easier time making consistent use of its abilities and powers, which are incredibly strong in both accounts. So do keep that in mind, and I do believe that Lucius may very well end up being the top Forge World despite everything Metallica has to offer. In third place comes Mars, and Mars was a Forge World that could easily hold the rank of best Forge World in previous codexes, and while it may still be a contender for that spot, the competition has become much greater for that title, and Mars has seen a bit of a downgrade in some ways within the 9th edition codex from where it was in the 8th edition codex. That being said, Mars is still a very powerful Forge World, but let's see what's changed with the 9th edition codex. The biggest hit comes to Mars from the character Belisarius Cawl, who used to be locked to the Forge World but has since become accessible to all Forge Worlds, although he does still benefit Mars units more than units of any other Forge World. That being said, the hit to Mars as far as Cawl is concerned comes not only from his restriction being unlocked, but also by his role in the game being changed. No longer is the called castle build of old the juggernaut that it used to be, but rather Cawl now takes a much more humble stance within the game as a whole, and while he will probably find a place in new Admech builds over time, at this point his fate is still up in the air, and it's unknown where he'll end up. In turn, Mars has lost their champion in more ways than one with the new codex, and as such has gone down in power level a bit as a result, but who knows, maybe we'll see Cawl once again creating a style of play all of his own in due time, though do keep in mind that the shooting version of the Castellans has been significantly gutted due to their double shoot protocol being erased completely and replaced with one that is basically unusable, so that's just one more nail in the Cawl coffin, though maybe we'll end up seeing Cawl with some Electro Priests or something like Iron Striders moving across the table and wreaking havoc. However, where Mars may have lost some power in the form of Cawl, it has gained some ground in other ways, such as the Dogma, which like Lucius contains 2 different parts to its abilities. The first being that Skitarii units benefit from the Canticles of the Omnissiah, meaning that a large portion of your army gains not only the Doctrina benefits but also the Canticles in addition to that, giving you the ability to stack buffs rather effectively. For example, you can combine the additional 3-inch movement on your Skitarii units from the Doctrina with the Canticle that allows you to roll 3 dice when making advance or charge rolls, or for example the bonus strength Canticle with the weapon skill Doctrina to hypercharge your melee attacks on units that want to be within melee. As well, this is a rather powerful ability that can put your Skitarii units over the top in many situations, and do remember that the majority of your army is going to be Skitarii. The second half of the Dogma is simply a minor perk, allowing you to reroll 1 hit roll when a unit is chosen to shoot or fight. Not a bad ability to have by any means, and it can add up if you have a lot of units in your armies, so don't discount it too quickly, and do keep in mind, in some ways this makes Mars favor smaller units instead of larger units, though this isn't strong enough to really make you warp your army around it, so don't worry about it too much if you're not making full use of this part of the Dogma, as the first part of the Dogma will be more than enough to make up for that. The Special Mars trait, on the other hand, isn't as impressive as the Dogma, because while it does allow you to change the active canonical on a target unit within 6 inches of the bearer of this trait, it's limited to a core Cult Mechanicus unit, meaning it's a bit narrow and restrictive in application, and sometimes won't be useful at all during certain turns, but sometimes it will be rather great and you'll be happy you have it. Maybe if this allowed you to give a unit 2 canonicals at the same time, it would be much more useful, but as it stands, the Codex has far more interesting Warlord traits these days. Although there's one thing to say about this trait is that it allows you to double up on certain canonicals, as it does allow you to use one that's already been used. In some cases that might just be enough to push it over the top. Though that being said, I think there are more Warlord traits to consider than this one, and in many cases you'll just end up passing on this one. In terms of relics, the Mars Red Axe has received a substantial buff in the new 9th edition Codex. It still requires you to replace an Omniscience Axe, making it limited to a Dominus or an Engine Seer, with the most likely choice being a Dominus. The Red Axe no longer only grants additional armor penetration, but now adds an impressive 3 additional attacks to the wielder. Considering the Omniscience Axe and by extension the Red Axe already received the buff on its baseline benefits, this does make it a very interesting weapon that could allow the Dominus to be a rather deadly force within close combat. That being said, there are a lot of good relics, and the Admech has gotten better in melee as a whole, which by extension makes this a little less impressive, but it's still something you shouldn't discount when choosing Mars, as there may be situations where the Red Axe can do some serious work and really make one of your characters an incredibly powerful melee threat. That being said, one thing I didn't mention in the Metallica video that I want to mention now is that if you take an Anzion pseudo-generator and the Ash Runner trait on a Dominus, you can actually make the Dominus a rather interesting melee threat, considering that with the Ash Runner ability and the +1 strength canonical, the Dominus goes up to a total of 8 strength with his Omniscience Axe. In addition to that, the pseudo-generator also brings him up to 8 strength, so on average the additional 3d3 attacks that the Anzions generates will generate a total of 6 attacks, meaning that on average the Dominus will be making 10 attacks at strength 8, 4 of which have 2 armor penetration and 2 damage, while 6 of them only have 1 armor penetration and 1 damage. All of those attacks are a bit lacking in armor penetration and damage, but considering how many you get and that you can get more than that, it actually makes a very interesting and impressive melee character. However, in many cases the Metallican Lung will just end up being better, especially if the Dominus is escorting a unit of Sicarians or something of that nature. Anyway, with that being said, let's get back to Mars and the stratagem that it offers. The Mars stratagem, known as Wrath of Mars, has experienced some changes that make it a bit different from its prior iteration within the 8th edition Codex. While it still gives a Mars unit the ability to cause 1 additional mortal wound on a roll of 6+ to wound, it has been restricted to a maximum of 6 mortal wounds caused by this stratagem. This isn't the end of the world, as it's still double that of similar stratagems in other armies, and to score 6 mortal wounds on average you need to be making 36 wound rolls with that unit, which is possible with some units, but is not necessarily as easy to achieve as one might think. However, Wrath of Mars also received a major buff as well, by being given a modular cost such that it will only cost 1 command point on units with a power level of 10 or less, and will only cost 2 command points on the units with power level greater than 10. Considering units that can make the most of this ability due to having a large number of shots generally are under 10 power level these days. This means you'll usually be paying half of the command points as you would be prior, and that is rather great for a command point hungry army like Admech. Not only that, but with units like Infiltrators, Corpuscari, Vanguard, and Rangers all being buffed in the 9th edition Codex, it makes it even easier to use Wrath of Mars to its full effect without having to spend 2 command points. Between the Dogma and Stratagem, Mars takes a very different approach to competing for the best Forge World, in that it's much more about raw strength instead of tricks that can pull to counter your opponent or being able to reposition incredibly easily. Even the Relic shows this by being an absolute beatstick that can turn the Dominus into a true melee threat against most targets. That's not to say Mars is all brute force and no cunning, as there's plenty to think about when combining Canonicals and Doctrina, but rather that it's higher in evident raw power than other aspects like Lucius or Metallica. In the long run, any one of these Forge Worlds can take the top spot for the best Forge World at any given time, and it may all come down to how the meta shifts, allowing each to take the top spot for a period of time as things change around them. That being said, the other Forge Worlds have all become stronger as well, and can also throw their hat into the competition for the top Forge World. So while many weren't mentioned in this video, in the next video we'll be taking a look at more Forge Worlds and where they fit into the greater scheme of the 9th edition Codex, with some of the Forge Worlds yet to come being contenders for the best Forge World as well, as they can easily find a home, and show us that even though that Forge Worlds like Metallica, Lucius, and Mars have incredible optionality, resilience, and raw power, they still might be overtaken by a Forge World that has something else to offer. Inversely, there might end up being a situation where a Forge World is very commonly seen not simply because of its own power, but because it's taken alongside other Forge Worlds. Considering some of the other Forge Worlds have very powerful abilities, but not core abilities that can be relied on fully, it does make sense that some Forge Worlds might be very popular as tag-along Forge Worlds. So join me next time when we continue our deep dive into the different Forge Worlds. Anyway, as always, if you've enjoyed the content, please remember to like and subscribe, as it really does help the channel out. And if you know anyone who can benefit from this video or any of the other videos on my channel, please do share the content, as it can help other players out in terms of buying and building an army. And as always, I'd like to give a shout out to my patrons for supporting the channel. Thank you very much, you guys are awesome people. And regardless if you're a patron or not, thank you for watching and have a great day. See you next time. Bye.